Hello and welcome to another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. This time we're looking at a car that is guaranteed to make a lot of classic car nuts go weak at the knees, and with good reason. The 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera 2.7 RS. Bit of a mouthful, but all very necessary. And this was a very, very interesting car at the time. It came about through a variety of circumstances, some of which were predictable and some weren't. And it also changed the game for Porsche. I think they were the most surprised of anybody about the outcome of this car. And this car set the mold for special, lightweight, pay more, get less, in some ways, 911s since. But I don't want to belittle or decry the car in any way, because it's a fabulous bit of kit, this car. It really is. The car in question, the 911, as so the story goes, was a new design, but based on the concept of the 356, air-cooled, rear-engined, lightweight, and before that, the VW Beetle that they were spawned from. That's how the story goes. There is another slightly more controversial school of thought that says that actually these were taken from a Czechoslovakian engineer called Hans Ledwinka, who worked for Tatra. And this slightly sort of breaks the story around Ferdinand Porsche inventing the rear-wheel drive, rear-engined, air-cooled vehicle. There is compelling evidence, shall we say, to suggest that Hans Ledwinka in the 1920s developed big and small, rear-wheel drive, rear-engined, streamlined, air-cooled cars. And one of them landed on no less than Hitler's desk as a people's car, and reportedly, allegedly, Hitler handed this over to Ferry Porsche and said, "Can we please build these?" And the rest is, if you believe that, history. And the other car that Ledwinka did make was a big, powerful, rear-engined, streamlined, air-cooled luxury car, which was one of the fastest cars of its time in the 1920s. And what was this car in 1973? So if you get a chance, do a little bit of looking into that story. Interesting background. It's very compelling that Ferdinand Porsche, and I don't want to decry anything he did because he was obviously an extremely clever engineer, but did the likes of this and the 356 and the Beetle, were they originally his brainchildren? We'll leave that one out to the jury. But be that as it may, here we are. We arrive at this car, and the 911 came out in 1964, and completely illogical design. The whole concept is very, very hard to get your head around because it just isn't the natural way of doing things. Packaging-wise, it's a very compelling argument. You've got a very compact engine, low slung, giving the car a low centre of gravity, and with plenty of space, room enough for two kids in the back, two adults, bit of luggage space up front, or luggage in the back seats if you prefer, they fold down. Really clever packaging. But in terms of sort of the basic intrinsic concept of handling and road holding, really, really quite flawed, actually. And Porsche considered that their mission in life, which they rose to the challenge of magnificently, of turning this rather absurd concept of having weight at either end of the car into something manageable and into a world beater. And some of this was called the dumbell effect. And here we have a dumbbell that's kindly volunteered to let me explain this. Very little weight in the middle, lot of weight either end. And if you imagine this is a Porsche 911, you've got the engine and gearbox here, and you've got the battery and a few other things at this end of the car. And what happens when the car goes round a corner? You get the dumbbell effect. The weight actually wants you to follow it. And this combined with the suspension geometry on the back, in particular on the 911, semi-trailing arms, which were notoriously unpredictable if you did the wrong thing in them, and actually caused the back end of the car to break away grip-wise quite substantially. This was an interesting combination of on-the-limit handling, and these 911s became known as a sort of double-edged sword, a curate's egg. On the one hand, they had unpredictable handling, they could do things that you weren't expecting, particularly because of that rear suspension that changed the camber angle of the wheel in relationship to the road. So instead of it being upright, it would swing with the suspension and lower the tyre contact area, and that's where the problems began. Or you had this great big lump at the back, which wasn't helping either. So on the one hand, they were a challenge, but on the other hand, people loved them because they were a challenge. And they weren't straightforward. They were a bit like an animal that had to be tamed, really. And that was one of the delights of the Porsche 911. And it was exemplified by this car. Now, when Porsche launched the 911, it had around about 130 brake horsepower. And that wasn't really enough to start causing serious problems and to start showing the rear suspension potential trouble. So that was okay. But as the years started to progress, and through the 1960s, Porsche started to develop more power. They upped the engine to 2.2, then 2.4 litres. The problems started to arise, and they got a bit of a reputation. So what Porsche did was move the wheelbase of the car, move the back wheel centerline back 2.3 inches or thereabouts. And it doesn't sound a lot, but what it did was actually that polar moment of inertia that I was talking about, where the weights swing, it actually moved the wheel towards one of the weights, which helped. And that was about as far as Porsche could go in terms of wheelbase, because what was left was the length of the engine and the rear bumper, and not much else. So they really couldn't squeeze the back wheels too much further back, or it would be very difficult to get the drive from the transmission to line up with the rear wheels. So it was all a bit of a compromise. So we're going to be doing a couple of jobs on this car, and of course we'll take it for a run. We can't cover everything that we're doing to the car within the scope of the video, but there's a couple of little tricks that we'll just take care of on the car and see where it goes. Well, one of the bywords with this car is precision, and this car really has got it in spadefuls. These days, all car manufacturers have electric power steering on their cars, or almost all of the mainstream production cars, and electric power steering does take away the feel. It really does. It's very much a barrier between the road and the driver. And if people want something honest, precise, really sort of a connection with the road, this car has got it, possibly, arguably, as much as any car in the world. It's just beautiful. I mean, I'm just steering it with my fingertips there. The steering wheel, I'm feeling every bump, but it's not like it's jarring the wheel out of my hands. It's just the tiniest imperfections in the road are being picked up and transmitted and fed back. It is utterly delightful. You don't get that with 99.9% of cars on the road. You just don't get that precision of knowing every last undulation in the road. It's like being, the best analogy I can give, it's like being in a four-wheel motorbike. You just feel everything. And the beautiful honesty and authenticity of this steering is mind-boggling. It's just wonderful. One of the things I have identified on early road test on this car is that the gear change has quite a lot of play in it. It's quite funny, the gear change on these at the best of times is like stirring pudding. It's almost like a blind spot that Porsche had. They made this beautiful driving machine with a pretty awful gear change. And there's no excuse for it, because the linkage goes straight along and into the gearbox like a Ferrari Dino, Ferrari Daytona, other contemporary cars of the time. And the gear change on those, okay, the synchromesh was nothing like as good as this, but the gear change was infinitely more positive. Anyway, all manufacturers have their blind spots. They have their areas that they just can't seem to get their heads around. And this was Porsche's at the time. So I'm going to pull this sleeve up, which is literally just a rubber bung over the top, a rubber sleeve. And yeah, I can see in the linkage. I mean, that's in first gear. And even though it's never very good, that is pretty awful. So I'm sure we can improve on that. Yeah, put some new bushes in there. We might have to re-drill something, but anyway, we'll sort it. What is it that makes these cars so coveted and so lusted after in classic car circles? I suppose if there was one word to sum it up, it's purity. These cars have a purity of line, which is very pleasing, but driving-wise, they are incredibly pure because, as I say, they're so light. Nothing's having to work terribly hard to make the car work really well. And that's very, very important. And in fact, quite a few of the venerated engineers around the world, I'm thinking of Gordon Murray as one example, fantastic, legendary car developer of our age. He expects things to be as light as possible, and with good reason, because it means everything else can take care of itself and doesn't have to compensate for weight. But so this car is very, very pure to drive. It really is. They're fantastic to drive. But what makes it so different to this one? We just had to have in this beautiful 2.7 911 from 1976. Same engine, different fuel injection system, slightly different level of tune, camshafts, etc. But very, very similar. I would say over 90% of the parts on these cars are interchangeable. But why is this car only worth a seventh or thereabouts of what this car is worth? Well, it's because of that extra 10%. This is one of the anomalies of the classic car market. This car is probably worth £500,000 in today's market. This car, probably 70,000, maybe a bit more. Equally beautiful cars. This is not a Concours car. It's driven and used. The owner goes regularly on tours, international tours with it. He enjoys using it. That's one of the reasons why the car is in such good shape mechanically. We're just doing final mind adjustments on most things. But why is it worth 7 times as much as this? Because it's on a different level purity-wise. That's a beautiful car. This is something special. Anyway, let's delve into things a bit more. Porsche in 1969 had the utterly fabulous 917 racing car, which was developed by Ferdinand Porsche's grandson, Ferdinand Piëch. And this was his brainchild, and it was an absolute world beater. It killed the competition in endurance racing. It had initially a 4.5 litre flat 12 air-cooled engine, a magnificent piece of engineering. And it just utterly dominated endurance racing to the point where the older equivalent of the FIA said, there's no competition. Ferrari are developing cars, other people are developing cars, but they can't touch the 917. So they rendered it instantly unqualifiable by lowering the CC capacity to 3 litres instead of 5. So that rendered the 917 out of the frame instantly. So what could Porsche do? They thought, well, hang on, we've got the 911, it's a compact, light, reasonably powerful car. Why don't we develop that and set that racing? Now, in order to do that, they had to come up with a concept that involved a lot of the racing parts and racing kit that they were going to use on the racetrack and actually homologate it. So they had to make 500 of the cars with this racing kit on that people could use on the road. That's how it worked. And Porsche sort of thought, what do we do? We've got this 911, which has great promise. We've tried to sort of tame the back-end handling. So why don't we develop that car? And that's exactly what happened. And the 911 2.4S in 1972 was a great car, but the engine, because of the problems I was talking about earlier with the length of the engine, they couldn't stretch the engine any further in terms of length. And all 6 cylinders, being a flat 6 engine, it's got 3 cylinders on the right, 3 on the left, horizontal, with a great big fan blowing air over the cylinders. That's a very simple concept of how it works. But the problem was the technology at the time, the cylinder barrels, and I've got one here. So you have 3 of these on the left-hand side, and then their counterpart, 3 on the right. Crankshaft in the middles. That's why it's called a boxer engine. It isn't technically a boxer engine because the pistons aren't moving in and out at the same time, but we'll go with that. And what they originally did was have a cast iron middle to cope with the wear of the piston and rings going up and down inside it, and aluminium fins were then put on the outside of it. I mean, they started off with cast iron liners altogether. The whole thing was cast, but thermally, that was a bit of a disaster, really. Aluminium is a much better transferer of heat. And these started to sort of rattle and come apart, which was also a thermal disaster, because as they separated from the cast iron middle, the last thing they did was cool it. So, what was the breakthrough? What enabled Porsche to get more capacity out of an engine where the centres between the cylinders were fixed by the length of the engine and the length of the rear overhang? This is where a bit of clever technology got translated from the 917 racing car into the 911. Because what Porsche developed in conjunction with Mahler, the piston manufacturer, was, Mahler presented Porsche with it, and they used it in the 917, was something called Nickel. And nickel is a compound of nickel, silicon and carbide. And they use the nickel to sort of make it grip onto the bore, but the silicon and the carbide is one of the hardest substances known to man. And they managed to coat bare aluminium with this coating. It's very, very thin, between 3 and 6 thousandths of an inch, I think. And this solved the problem because aluminium wears. If you had a piston and rings running up and down in that, it would wear out in next to no time. But Mahler said to Porsche, we've got this nickel, why don't you use it on the 911 engine? And the whole advantage of this situation is they could increase the capacity because they actually could have a bigger bore because the wall could be thinner because there didn't need to be a cast iron insert in the middle of it. So this is one lump of aluminium. And that meant they could get more capacity. So the bore went up to 90 millimeters, I think, and they could get bigger pistons in, and the engine could be stretched from sort of the limit, as it was, of 2.4 litres to 2.7. And that was the breakthrough. But the big shock was Porsche didn't quite know what the public's reaction to this was going to be, because they basically made them as a byproduct, sounds crazy now, to be able to go racing, to get rid of 500 of them to go racing. And they were so nervous about the public's reaction, they actually gave them to directors of Porsche to drive around in to save having to sell them. They just road registered them, and it was another car sale. Lo and behold, Porsche put this on the Paris Motor Show stand, I think it was, in 1972, and people just bought them like hot cakes. They couldn't get enough of them, to the point where the 500 that Porsche needed to sell sold, I think, almost within a week of the car being on display in Paris. An extraordinary result. What did Porsche learn from this? They learned that you can actually charge higher prices for a car with less equipment in it, but more technology. And Porsche have been adhering to that ethos ever since. The GT2, the GT3 are still with us, all spawned from this car. And nobody was more surprised than Porsche. And in fact, they were in such demand that they went on to make another 500 after the initial 500, and another 500 and odd after that. But what people didn't know was Porsche, whereas they had to homologate various bits on this car, like the fiberglass rear engine lid, a very thin panelled body shell, quite thin front wings and roof. It was 0.1 millimetre, thinner than the standard pressed steel. And by the time they'd finished with the 500, Porsche didn't want to carry on doing that. So they actually ratcheted back the technology a little bit, and they started to raid the 911S parts bin for the Sanction 2 and Sanction 3 cars. This particular car is a very interesting car because it is one of the original 500 lighter RSs. It's not a lightweight car, an M471 as it's called. It's a touring car, an M472 to give it its option number. But it is one of the original light 500 cars. So this car weighs round about 1,050 kilos, 1,075. A modern 911 is anything from sort of 1,500 to 1,800 kilos. So huge difference. This is one of the reasons why these cars drive so well, is because they're so light. Nothing has to work terribly hard to make it go around corners and stop and accelerate. But this particular car is a lovely car. It's come in for a service and a few jobs, but it was owned from new by a baron, a British baron, who commuted in this car from his Scottish estate to his house in Belgravia in London, and also to his French house in the Alps. And he racked up over 100,000 miles in this car during his ownership. And the car is now, the person who's brought it in here, is only the fourth owner of the car, and the whole history is documented. Absolutely lovely. So very interesting car, makes a big difference that it's one of the original 500 RSs, faithful to the vision, lighter weight, more interesting. One thing I am going to do to this car, I've noticed that it's revving too high. And you have to be careful with 911 engines. The speed at which the rev limiter cuts in is very, very important. Give you an example, the 930 Turbo 3.3, I think the rev limiter from memory is set at around 6,500. If it goes to 6,700, 6,800, it starts to actually stretch the big end bolts, not what you want, with disastrous results. So the rev limiter is very important. I'm going to take the rotor arm out of the distributor cap here. The rev limiter on these is very, very simple, but fiendishly clever in a way. It's a centrifugal rev limiter. So as the rotor arm spins, distributing the spark to the different cylinders, this slides along with centrifugal force and eventually shorts out on there, on that little tang. And that's the rev limiter. It's as simple as that. It's centrifugal force. But this is revving too highly. So what I'm going to do is use this extremely high-tech Porsche tool, part number 9753648 in case you're really interested. And I'm going to according to Porsche directives, adjust this rev limiter tang slightly, like that. And we can try it. That should be around about 7,200 engine RPM now. These used to be preset by Bosch, but I found that they're a little more inconsistent these days, but we can give that a shot. We can always adjust it again very carefully using the special tool. Well, what I'm doing now is taking a spark plug out, because having driven it on the road, I suspect it's running just a little bit weak. It's not as, it's what I would call fluffy, low down. It's not as crisp as I would like. There we go. The engine's cooled down, of course, otherwise I wouldn't be able to do this. Yeah, it's too weak. The mixture is slightly too weak. We know that the injectors are all in good fettle. The engine's absolutely fine. This car has been driven regularly, so it's not a museum piece. It's a working, proper operating car. So I know that this is not an exception. All 6 cylinders will be the same as this. So I can confidently alter the mixture on the fuel injection system accordingly, which is good news. So I shall do that now. Well, what I'm doing now is actually adjusting the mixture on the fuel injection pump, which is tricky, if not impossible, but we can do it. There is a hole that Porsche have strategically placed at the back here to do exactly this. So just trying to get the socket in there. There we are. That is engaged. And that's it. Don't try this at home. There we go, ready for a run. Right, so we've fixed the gear change, we've adjusted the fuel injection, and we'll take it on the road and see how it performs. I'm just warming the car up now. We've set up the fuel injection system. I've just moved the mixture screw on the pump one click. These older fuel injected engines, high performance engines, Mercedes 300 SL, these cars with the multi-point injection, the mechanical injection, they love being just a touch on the rich side, and that spark plug was almost too normal, really. They just need to be a touch rich to work at their best. Not so that the spark plug is black, but a very good colour. But this car is just coming to life wonderfully. All air-cooled Porsches of any year are known for their magnificent steering feedback. So even the Gold 911 has steering that feels very similar to this. There's, for all the wrong reasons in a way, there's no weight over the front end of the car, as I said earlier. But the payback is just this incredibly light, precise steering. But what makes this car different from the Gold 911 in the workshop? What makes it such an icon? What makes it on the top 10 wish list of people's Porsches ever built? Well, let's slot it down a cog or two and find out. Oh, the acceleration is just intoxicating. I mean, by modern standards, 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds, and around 150 odd miles an hour is, in particular, is not fast. But the joy of the power curve on this car, it just feels, to use the vernacular, proper quick. Into the corner, brakes, power out. Oh, what an absolute delight this car is. Why is it worth so much money? Why is it so coveted? Because it's just a wonderful thing. It's a blisteringly quick car to cover the ground on from A to B on a day like this. Okay, it's can't compare to modern cars in so many ways, but the satisfaction and sheer joy that you derive from driving this car, I can understand why they're worth what they are. They really are. I mean, when these are set up as this one is, they are just an absolute wondrous thing. And the acceleration is markedly quicker than the standard 2.7. The engine mechanically, as I explained earlier with the Nickersill liners, is mechanically almost identical. Different cam profiles, different details, different injection system, but this thing really is potent, just wonderful, absolutely beautiful. Set it up in the corner, just fantastic. Just wonderful. And that engine now, it's on song and running beautifully, is pulling like a train. Oh, what an absolute pleasure this car is. Once again, just it's pulling. It's such a tractable engine, this. This rev counter isn't quite right. We're going to have to send this off actually, because it does need recalibrating. But just pulls from any revs. Still plenty left. Absolutely wondrous. Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. difficult to feel in a 1973 car that you're running out of road, but you do get that feeling. It's so quick. But the beauty of this car as well, one of the wonderful things about it is it's so small, it's petite. It's not like a Ferrari Testarossa or a Daytona. It's sort of Dino-sized and very light, 1,070 kilos in this trim. So a modern 911 is between 30 and 40% heavier than this car. Can you believe that? And of course, power to weight on modern Porsches is vastly superior, we know that. But even so, 30 to 40% extra weight is a lot of lardiness to overcome with safety kit and protection equipment and electronics. It's a lot to overcome just to get back to this sort of feel. And this is part of the car's essence because it's so light on its feet. The suspension is firm, and the tyres are big for 1973, but for these days they're family saloon tyres, and none the worse for that because the dampers don't have to be ridiculously stiff. I mean, they are taut, but because the car's so light, all of this takes care of itself. They don't have ridiculously big springs and dampers and anti-roll bars. That lightweight really does pay dividends. Once again, just the acceleration is just wonderful. And now that we've got that gear change sorted out, that's lovely too. It just slicks straight through the gears with negligible play. It's about as good as I mentioned earlier, it's one of the car's weak points in my opinion, but it's about as good as it can be now, changing gear. Yeah, Porsche managed to tame the dumbbell effect, the pendulum effect of having all that weight at the back on this car by putting the big flared arches on it and the slightly wider wheels, but you still very much need to be like this. Accelerate out of the corner rather, and not decelerating halfway through, not taking your foot off the throttle. You can still end up in the scenery with all that weight behind you. The car can go into snap oversteer, as it's called, and if you change throttle position in the corner from acceleration to deceleration, I'll demonstrate now how much it affects the attitude of the car. So on acceleration it swats down, and on deceleration the nose goes down and the back goes up, and that affects what's happening with the back wheels, and it actually alters the angle at which the tyres are sitting on the road to a very large degree. Even a few centimetres difference can alter the camber, and that combined with the weight at the back is what causes the potential snap off oversteer. So you really have to drive these in the classic slow in, fast out configuration. Of course that makes them all the more pleasurable, but you do have to know what you're doing. The later car, the 3.3 turbo, I've had a few moments in 3.3 turbos test driving them over the years. Yeah, I remember in a 3.3 turbo I was delivering back to a customer about 30 years ago. I was coming round a sweeping dual carriageway right hand bend, which was also uphill, and I was doing 70 miles an hour into the bend, which was the legal limit, no problem. Then because it was uphill, even though my pedal was on the accelerator, it started to come on boost, and before I knew it, the turbo had fully spooled up coming out of the corner, and the steering wheel was sort of there trying to compensate for it. I had a sort of 30-degree drift at some unmentionable speed happening coming out of the bend, simply because the turbo had spooled up. But because 911s of this era are the way they are, you don't want to back off halfway around a corner, because that could spell problems. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Porsche lengthened the wheelbase by a heady 2.3 inches as they upped the horsepower and upped the grip with wider wheels. But this was all in an effort to tame that that very big rear overhang weight. But this is still a thing of wonder. It really is a fabulous, fabulous car. Well, that concludes another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please like, please subscribe, please share. It's the lifeblood of the channel in a way, and we'll be back with something else very soon.